Hello and welcome. Welcome to Deep Noetics. Today I have James Simpkin with me. James has done the course on the philosophy of the machine, which I taught, which ended about 2 or was it 3 weeks ago. And he's got some very interesting things to say about warfare in the age of AI, about defense in the age of AI. And let's just get right into it and tell us about your PhD, what you've done in your PhD, what your interest is, and also why it is in that area.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. I very much enjoyed doing the philosophy of the machine course, and the reason why I wanted to do that is because last year I completed my PhD at the University of Leeds on the relationship between the US and the UK over ballistic missile defence, which is a multi-billion-dollar system, a cybernetic system, if you will, that is intended to protect. So the advertising goes protect sort of NATO and North America from a nuclear missile attack from a state like North Korea or Iran if they were to develop nuclear weapons. And what spoke to me about your course is that idea. What I'm more deeply interested in is I'm interested in the way that military technologies, alter the ethics of warfare and alter the strategies of warfare. And I think what the philosophy of the machine course enabled me to do was to think more around issues around drones and AI, sort of expanding that field out away from ballistic missile defense to something that is a bit more dynamic and emergent, particularly as we've seen since the war on terror and into the Ukrainian conflict, where it seems like drone warfare is becoming what's called a revolution in military affairs, which is basically a revolutionary. One definition of a revolution in military affairs is where if a technology comes into that battle, you cannot win a war without having that technology. And it
Mhm.
seems like drones are becoming something like that. If any two countries have a conflict or there's a civil war in future, if one side does not have drones, then it will be bound to lose.
Interesting. Yes, I find it also interesting to look at warfare in the, let's say, post-nuclear age, because what we have there, I'd say for the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, is a weapon that's by its own destructive force a deterrent in a way, right? Like, because you could say that in the First World War, we've kind of brought everything forward. We've climaxed the old school way of warfare, brought forward all these young men from the different nationalities, and just they threw everything they had at each other, right? Now that kind of continued and escalated into the horrors of the Second World War, but we've now come to a point where all of these strategies, they don't work that well anymore. Like I said, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert in warfare whatsoever, but like this coming with airplanes and bombing an area, that mainly works in underdeveloped countries that don't have modern defense systems. But uh, am I right in assuming that like countries with a modern military have no problem in defending against airplanes and like shooting down airplanes?
Well, there are multiple technologies that attempt to deal that. Of course, that no air defence is anywhere near 100% effective.
Okay.
But even if you can manage to intercept a certain percentage of incoming drones or missiles or aircraft, it can give you an advantage. If you're able to intercept, just to pick a figure out of the air, 51% of the enemy's incoming uh, munitions, let's say, and they can only intercept 49%, then you've got a 2% victory gap.
Right.
And that feeds in a lot into ways in which game theory tries to plan things out. But just coming back to your first point there, and about drones, you talked about bodies,
Mhm.
and as we've noticed in the past and in the present, the human body is something which obviously is put on the line and is put at risk
Hmm.
in warfare, and that's a very Clausewitzian sort of whites of their eyes approach to warfare, and that is intended to have something of a regulating effect on warfare, because if we're talking about the 20th century at least, going into the 21st century, in the 20th century, obviously soldiers' lives were put on the line, and this actually it creates a very big break on militarism, because there is only so much that a government can get away with
Hmm.
before there is a public uprising. I mean, if you think of the Vietnam War as an absolutely classic example of that. Now, what some people, I mean, there's a great theorist. I would really recommend this book, Drone Theory by Gregoire Chailloux. Absolutely great book on drone warfare. But what he points out is, and counterintuitively, is that drones actually make warfare more likely because they remove the body from the war zone. So if you are a belligerent nation, you might actually be encouraged to start wars because your soldiers' lives will no longer be at risk, and the public will remain mostly blasé to that conflict because there's no one's body on the line. They're not going to get drafted up.
Right. Some people may know my background is in I partially come from Afghanistan, and I was wondering, would you say that that also contributed to this notion of the forever wars, that to this idea that, for example, Afghanistan, this was a war that was kind of in 2007, it was already more or less known that it was pointless or it wasn't leading anywhere, but it still dragged on until 2021. Do you think that was a contributing factor? The fact that a lot of the troops deployed there, I mean, a lot of them died, but like in no comparison to the amount of Afghans that died, right? That this kind of kept going on because a lot of it had become just this sort of mix of automated drone warfare and underground intelligence work. Do you think that that's a contributing factor?
Well, that's exactly right. Where the drone warfare really was developed and honed was in the Afghanistan conflict,
Mhm.
because such a vast and unwieldy landscape.
Mhm.
But also, and this is again, people often think of Obama as more of a peaceful president, but it was under Obama that a lot of the real protocols around drone warfare were actually developed and strengthened.
Mhm.
And today in Afghanistan, just as you were saying there, you could actually make the argument that drone warfare allowed the coalition to eventually leave Afghanistan, because what we might say now is that the whole of Afghanistan is basically, to use a term from drone warfare, is basically a gigantic kill box. So
Right.
what that refers to is, you can imagine on the computer game screen where you've got the sort of sights, or on the drone screen, and the person who is in the middle is in the kill box, so to speak, that can be fired on. Well, with drone warfare, we could have drones loitering around the outskirts of Afghanistan, and now, because the Taliban leadership are actually in government positions, they're known, they can be targeted, and
Mhm.
this is exactly what happened to the leader of Al Qaeda a year or two
Mm.
ago, Zawahiri. He
Mhm.
was actually, so the news reports say, on his balcony at a safe house in Kabul, and was taken out by a drone from some quite a distance. So this has enabled, if you so to speak, the US forces to step out of Afghanistan, with the Afghanistan leadership knowing that if they were to try and sponsor someone like Bin Laden again, that they could be easily taken out, because now they are the government. They're
Right.
not in the caves of Tora Bora anymore.
I was wondering as well whether that was a contributing factor to the supreme leader of the Taliban not showing himself. Like he's, as far as I know, he doesn't he doesn't go to Kabul. He remains in Kandahar most of his time in his residence. There's no videos of him speaking. There's no press conferences he gives, but all of the decrees are coming straight from him officially, and there's no pictures, or at least no recent pictures. So potentially that could be a reason for that. I mean, maybe on one hand, it's this sort of holy mystique, this, not engaging in worldly matters such as press conferences, but also potentially, an awareness of that fact that they are potential easy drone targets, and then thus they're still kind of half in that war mentality, in that obfuscating, hidden kind of identity.
They're in the kill box.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I would agree with that, and I think that's deliberate. That's not just a happy byproduct.
Right.
This is the revolutionary nature of the drone and the forever war and the everywhere war. The drone allows war to be prosecuted everywhere across the world at any time. The Gorgon stare, all these kind of, as we touched on in Philosophy of the Machine, these Greek words that come up all the time with regards to drone warfare, etc.
I see. And I saw a video once about the Iraq War, talking about it in these terms, that it was the first cybernetic war, in the sense that it was live streamed to basically to TVs in the West.
Yeah.
So you had a war for the first time in which there was more participants watching it than actually being engaged in it, or like being victims of it, right? And that is also an interesting phenomenon. And I feel like this is kind of climaxing now in terms of the Ukraine war, where it has become like a global social media event in a way. It's become a global social media event. And there's something I don't understand. And I really hope you have an answer to this, because I'd be very happy to hear your opinion on this. But whilst everything outside of Ukraine and around it, like with the drones, but also with this whole social media aspect of it, it's almost like, I know it sounds morbid, but it's almost like people are cheering on a sports team, right? They put it there, the one flag into their profile, the other put the other flag. This is going on outside of it. It's very, very hyper modern or postmodern, or whatever you want to call it. But then on the battlefield, we've kind of gone back to the First World War. Like the stuff we hear about the battlefield, it's basically like ground infantry trench warfare almost. You have just these like bodies of men dying all on the ground in like Bakhmut, for example, in these cities. So how come the war itself, the confrontation itself, has kind of gone back to old school methods? And is it because of this deterring effect? Is it because we're like, okay, we can't use nuclear weapons, we can't upgrade one level of technology, because that would be an escalation no one wants? So, but we still want the war, we still want the goals we want to achieve with the war. So we just go back, let's a generation, we just go back a century and still fight the war.
Yeah, great points there, Sean. So just on the first one about media saturation. So recently read this book called Radical War, Data Retention and Control in the 21st Century by Matthew Ford and Professor Andrew Hoskins. And they make this point that in the Gulf War, there were hundreds of hours of media coverage. The Syrian civil war generated 40 years of footage in a decade, and the war in the Ukraine, this was several months ago, has generated this much in its first 80 days. So we have got a digital ecology where consumers can subscribe to their favorite narrative of a given war just as easily as accessing Airbnb or Uber. So we've got this intense saturation, but there are a few issues around that, and one of them is the idea that you would think that because there is such information out there right now, it would be easy to prosecute war crimes, etc. But it almost makes it more difficult because there is such a fragmentation of data and information that there's so much that people just can't pass the amount of data there. But coming back to nuclear weapons, again, a little bit of a deeper critique here. You mentioned that contrast between, you know, boots on the ground, World War One, and that kind of conflict in the Ukraine on the ground, and then nuclear warfare. And I think this is where, on the ground, we see a failure of game theory. I'm not an expert in game theory, but what I understand from it is that, I mean, this is the fundamental flaw I feel in game theory and warfare, is that it's predicated on a kind of rationality, and war is not rational.
Mm-hmm.
If it was rational, there would have been a calculation before, you know, Russia invaded the Ukraine, and one side would, you know, maybe the Russians would have said, well, we don't know what the outcome of this war is going to be, but maybe they would have said, no, we will not do this because we're going to end up losing, or we're going to end up, it's going to be a Pyrrhic victory. But that obviously didn't take place, and the war happened. So I don't think game theory works at the level of boots on the ground, but I do think it works at the level of nuclear exchange, because the leaders' bodies are at risk. I do not think, you know, I don't think this will end up in World War III. I don't think that the Ukrainian conflict will lead to a nuclear war, limited or otherwise, because the stakes are too high, and Putin's body is literally at risk, and the country of Russia is literally at risk. So I do think that is a space in which game theoretic rationality does work. To come back to that idea of, you know, skin in the game, Putin will not risk a war because he is a rational actor, to the extent that I don't think he would want himself to die, and Russia, millions and millions of Russian citizens to die in the nuclear warfare. However, you know, whether it was a miscalculation at the boots on the ground level, that's why I don't think that that game theory works, you know, when the leaders are not at risk.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's hard to tell anyways, right? It's hard to tell in a system that's so complex, such as a war, right? It's hard to tell what the right calculation would have been, right? Regardless what side. Yeah, that's an interesting point, and especially with the modern technology, that we have this regress because the next level of technology endangers your own body. And then now, as you just said, with the drone warfare, you have the detachment, you could say, from the body on site. And on top of this, I would say there's also political aspect, right? If you have the world split, if you have a threat, if you conceive of a threat, or you have the world split into two fronts, like in the Cold War, there's also a political aspect of like, it's either them or us kind of mentality. And I feel like maybe in today's age that is lacking a bit. And there is this notion of I think Yanis Varoufakis mentions, there's this notion of techno-feudalism when it comes to our economies, and I don't want to get into that, but maybe this metaphor, this medieval metaphor, can be actually applied to the postmodern age, that we're actually in a form of second Middle Ages, right? Second Middle Ages, in the sense that Middle Ages weren't one big world war, but you had many different factions, many different empires, and they were sometimes allied, sometimes at war, sometimes allied with the others, sometimes at war with the others. You know, it was kind of, and that's something that seems more imaginable, just instead of in Europe on a global scale. That's kind of something that we're seeming to be entering. And the same way information has gotten relevant. So information warfare is a big one. Propaganda is no longer just like a side effect or a tool for warfare. Propaganda has become the battlefield, almost, you could say. And you could say that the warfare is, the drones is just the external symptom of the information warfare. And there is another thing, like this whole ideal of the internet and the global kind of access to information, that is kind of breaking down in real time, where it's like we're going to have sealed off information bubbles in each empire, in each militaristic empire, that's kind of reinforcing its own armament and its own empire in a way. That is something I'm seeing. What would your view be on this?
Yeah. So what 2 points to that. The first point would be about the breaking off of the internet, this sort of utopian project, into various controlled bubbles of information. It just reminds me of John Gray, the philosopher John Gray, and he talks about he's sort of mocking the idea of progress, and he says, back in the 1840s, there were visionaries who thought that if we had canals and train tracks and the telegraph, then all humanity could be united and we wouldn't have any more wars. Well, it just led to the more efficient transport of tanks, etc. You could see the as you mentioned there, the splitting up of different internet bubbles into just more precise propaganda tools and means of control. Now, talking about the Middle Ages and bringing this back a bit more to drones and nuclear weapons and philosophy, I would say the big difference from sort of the medieval times to the modern times, and even if we're talking about neo-feudalism, I would still say this is an aspect of modernity perhaps that still holds, is, and having studied this with Johannes a little bit, is the Heideggerian notion of the abolition of distance bringing no nearness.
Mm-hmm.
So just as Heidegger talks about technology leading to alienation and the phrase that I just mentioned there, it's only because of the rocket, it's only because of the drone, it's only because of the global GPS network that people can sit in an air-conditioned drone booth and have 4K zoomed in live feeds of people getting killed and be able to do that while suffering less PTSD than someone who does on the front line. There are lots of studies that show that, yes, if you are a drone pilot, they are less likely to suffer PTSD. They do suffer a certain kind of PTSD called moral injury, because obviously they're not at risk physically. But what seems to cause the kind of moral injury that takes place is because there's no decompression. So if you were a soldier in Iraq and you were on a tour of duty, the fact that you had to fly home maybe dozens of hours, several hours in the case of Europe to finish your tour of duty still meant that the war zone was over there. If you are a drone pilot and you literally finish your shift and drive 30 minutes home and then you can have dinner with your family, that is a really jarring, specific type of PTSD which drone pilots do suffer from. And again, I think it comes back to this, the abolition of distance bringing no nearness. And that goes right to the top. You could be a world leader ensconced in your bunker, and that's the only way that you could possibly countenance killing millions of people in 3 minutes. With the caveat that I mentioned earlier, that I still think even if you somehow manage to survive the initial conflict, your country is going to be in ruins. It's still going to make you think rationally about the cost of starting a nuclear war.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I would like to also get a bit into like the specifics of the technologies, especially now because we mentioned in the beginning AI, and that is something on the information front which already has its effects, but that's not going to be all of it, right? It's going to have its effects on the warfare front as well, or already does. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but just a few years ago, I think 3 years ago, the UK Defense Ministry published a document in collaboration with the German, I think the German army, about human enhancement or human augmentation. Are you familiar with that document? Have you heard of it?
I've heard of it. I'm not familiar with that document, but
Yeah, it's yeah, so it's a big document, and it's actually compared. I looked at many documents of this sort. I looked at AI and development for military. From I even had someone find stuff from Russia and China and different countries. But that one was by far the most professionally done, specifically also looking at the societal impact and studying various authors, what they've written about technology. They've really brought in some expertise there, whereas other documents have been written by bureaucrats tend to be quite dry and not really very well thought through. That one struck me as the best one I've seen so far, so I recommend it. The only other one that I thought was very good had the same title, Human Enhancement, and was from the 60s, from I think what was NASA. And it actually referred to, it used the same word, but it just referred to the computer. So it like the computer was already seen as a human enhancement, just like, you know, you could say the human enhancement is already present in the drone warfare. But now human enhancement has specifically gone towards neuro and biotechnology. And my degree I'm studying is neuroengineering. It goes very much in that direction. So we have a mandatory ethics part of our course. And what they're getting into are the specifics of bio and neurotechnology and AI, how they can play out. And we're speaking of information for soldiers on the ground that can be directly broadcasted, you know, into their brain, orders that can be broadcast into their brain, location sense that is somehow augmented via GPS right into the neural structure. A lot of it is science fiction. A lot of it, I'd say, it takes a while until that even begins to be feasible. But the thoughts and the, you know, discussion of these topics is obviously already there, and the thought of like creating, you know, genetically optimized soldiers, of having command lines that are optimized via AI, of having machine learning processes optimize. And there we're getting back to game theory. So the question there is, does the war break with game theory, or is the war so complex that a regular computation, you cannot put all the variables in a regular computation, but then you can using machine learning, or at least you can attempt it.
Right. Okay. No, that's really fascinating. Yeah, that's not something. Yeah, could you get a truly game theoretic calculation through AI? Wow. Yeah. I suppose how I could speak to that AI argument is not so much through the augmentation aspect of it, but a lot of the debate around drones in general, be they flying drones or turret drones, is the idea of whether they can ever actually be truly autonomous. So at the moment, it's almost looking as though there may be an addition to the Geneva Conventions to ban fully autonomous robots. So that there will always have to be a human in the loop that makes the decision to pull the trigger. And actually, Shemayo writes a lot about this in Drone Warfare. You know, if we went the opposite route and just allowed people to, allow fully autonomous robots, what's wrong about that is one of the things that's wrong about that is basically if you are killed by an autonomous drone, it strips you of your human dignity because you're basically killing yourself. There is no other conscious agent in that interaction other than you, the human, because you basically like being killed by a rock slide. An autonomous, an agent without a soul, let's say, has led to your death. So therefore, there's no humanity in that. But again, bringing that back to a lot of more philosophical points, a deeper point about the autonomous drones comes back to just war. And it's the idea that what actually makes war just, what actually makes war different from just legalized homicide like the purge or something like that. And it's the idea that if you are a combatant, the enemy and yourself, you are at some kind of risk of death. That is what makes it war. Because yes, you might have different, or quite radically different levels of sophistication of weaponry, but at least there is a chance that you can both be killed. And this is kind of what gives just war one of its underpinning sort of ethical drivers. So if you take the soldier or the pilot out of the war zone, it can lead to this situation called virtualless war, which is as Shamayo puts this, it's kind of a Nietzschean resentment. How Shamayo puts it is kind of what we see as a society reflected in the suicide bomber to a certain degree is this still kind of heroism of putting yourself on the line to die. And that's kind of negated by the drone, because the drone pilot does not put themselves on the line in the same way. And almost at a societal level, that's one of the reasons Shamayo argues that we hate the suicide bomber so much, is because as a society, we've lost some of that virtue of warfare, so to speak. And he's not saying that. This is what's great about Shamayo's argument. He's not saying that because he's a warmonger. He kind of is using a based argument. He's using a pro-war argument to make an anti-war case. So he's saying that we should move away from drones and automated warfare. We should move back to a more Clausewitzian idea of the whites of their eyes. And ironically, or counterintuitively, let's say, that will actually reduce the likelihood of warfare, because then you've really got to put people in harm's way, and the populace, will rise up against that. Whereas with drones, we will get these forever wars.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I find it generally a very, I would say, perverse way of talking about there's obviously no better way of talking about the virtues of war and rules in war, and because war just seems like something that comes about when you go beyond all of the rules, when you go beyond all of the diplomacy and negotiation, then war begins, and then kind of all bets are off, you'd think. But even there seems to be like distinctions. Even there are like gradual differences. Like there was a difference between how the Third Reich in the Second World War treated the West Front and the East Front. And there's a difference between how people are treated in wars in Europe compared to in wars in the Middle East, right? And then also during a war, the level of violence and carnage kind of varies as well, kind of escalates. So there's nothing particular I was going to say about this, but I just find it so morbid that you kind of speak of rules. We're making rules to not use this or that when we end up killing each other. It's such a strange sense, right? We're currently collaborating diplomatically to have rules in place for when we kill each other.
Yeah.
It's strange, but I think it's something that always kind of existed in some way. There's always some sort of, like, even in Afghanistan, the Pashtuns, they are the people in the east in the Hindu Kush Mountains. A lot of the Taliban are Pashtuns, most of them, I would say. Their language is predominantly Pashtun, and there is a tribal code, because there's no, in a lot of places, no government. There's a tribal code that people adhere to, and in the tribal code there is like prescriptions about blood revenge. There's prescriptions about, taking what the other has taken from you and all that, blood revenge and death, but also rules about peace and hospitality. Like even if your enemy comes to your house and seeks help and hospitality, you are obliged to give it to them, right? And then the next day you may be killing each other again. And so it's interesting that like we have these things on large scale, and you can even find them on such tribal society, such as Afghanistan. But then again, it's tribal and also known to be a warrior society as well. So
no, I mean that makes perfect sense in terms of, we could contrast that realism in international relations, which says that there is nothing but a balance of power. And all you can do is absolutely maximize the most ruthless ends to defeat the enemy. But even out of that maximalization of sort of ruthlessness, so to speak, that ends up generating, as you mentioned there, its own rules and regulations. So just to come back to nuclear weapons, etc. Something that I covered a lot in my PhD thesis, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972 was brought in specifically to prevent missile defense from being developed. And you would think, well, why would that be? If you could build missile defense, wouldn't that be good? It means we would have a shield, and we could stop. We could prevent nuclear war that way. But it was seen that if you have a shield, then suddenly everyone wants to build more swords. So it would have led to a greater proliferation of nuclear weapons. And this was right at the, where the Soviets and the United States were edging towards each having around 40,000 nuclear weapons each. Today, that's around the thousands. So even two highly belligerent nations such as the United States and Russia, they can still sort of talk each other down through that massive mobilization of force. I mean, obviously it could go wrong. That's always the fear. But just to expand on that a little bit more, you talked about the rules of engagement that the Taliban have about if someone comes to them who's injured, etc. And again, it reminds me a little bit of the Geneva Convention. But it also reminds me of, again, just to come back to Shamayu and what he talks about, what's called asymmetrical warfare, which is the dangers with drone warfare, and how you can get this kind of moralization of the West being better. I'm sorry, the point I'm trying to make is that you can actually make an argument whereby stripping the moralization out of warfare actually makes war less likely. So,
exactly,
for example, so for example, if you've got two sides and one justifies its campaign because they're the righteous ones, well, the other side just says exactly the same thing. So you're never going to have a war ending on one side saying that we admit that we were the bad guys. That's just not going to happen. Whereas with just war theory, like the moral nature of the combatants is an irrelevance. You've got this equal right to fight, and under that equal right to fight, you can at least commit to some kind of norms, and one side can go down fighting, so to speak. So it's not about whether you were moral or not; it's whether you were actually defeated or not. And then underneath that, there are these reciprocal norms about surrendered troops, let's say, because you would hope that if your troops surrendered to that side, they will reciprocate to you. Well, in reality, it may not turn out that way, but at least there is something there to recognise that fact.
Yeah, but when it comes to asymmetric warfare, I think that's an interesting one as well, because what we have in the modern age, and I suppose that it has happened before in the past, but I think the contrast of technologies maybe has never been this great. That you have, and like especially if you look at Afghanistan now, you have one side which is basically a tribal society. We're talking about one of the biggest tribal societies in the world, which haven't been seen in Europe and America for a long time. I mean, the tribal societies in the United States were Native Americans, right? That's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And basically with very old, like Bronze Age traditions, a very agricultural society. 80% of Afghanistan's population lives on the countryside, and countryside really means like no electricity, nothing, right? Um, and at the same time, you get this other side equipped with drones. This other side equipped with drones and with an insane intelligence and security apparatus. And that's this contrast always struck me as mind-boggling, that yet you have the fastest fiber cable internet in most of Afghanistan that you wouldn't get in Germany. You know, you wouldn't find internet that fast and quick. And it's like, now that talking to you, I actually kind of realize why the internet is so good. You know, it's like it makes sense. It's to build the box, right? It's part of the box, more or less. And so I find that so extreme. It's this there's this author called Iranian author called Reza Nagaristani, and he writes this theory fiction. It's kind of,
Yes.
you know, Nagaristani?
I've heard of him. Yes, I haven't read his stuff, but I have heard of him.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's hard to read, I have to admit, but it's like fiction in one sense, that he kind of brings in Lovecraftian kind of ideas, but it's theory in the other sense, that it's influenced by Deleuze and things like that. And he speaks of this like urban force against the desert force. You know, it's the urban power against the desert power. And his like fantasy theory fiction aspect is that he claims the Tellurian revolution, that is the revolution of the earth against the sun, is like stems from a conscious oil entity, and that oil itself is conscious in a way, and it resembles the spice in the science fiction novel Dune, and it kind of brings it maximizes oil burning via bringing about the bringing having the desert and the urban force clash. And you look at the Middle East today and you see like these cities like Dubai just surrounded by desert and surrounded by nomadic people and things like that. And that's kind of, it's kind of become symptomatic or like symbolic for most of the recent wars, that post-Cold War wars, with the exception now of Ukraine. I think this is, we've now entered like a new phase with Ukraine. But until then, you kind of didn't necessarily need to pick as a Western NATO alliance, you didn't need to pick a fight with Russia or China or whatever, which may now be coming in this neo-medieval power struggle phase. But instead, you kind of went and had these postmodern, strange, intransparent, confusing wars in the Middle East, with this insane clash of urban power that is just fueled with oil, and this desert tribe. There's a tribe on the other side, and it's a very strange phenomenon that you have continuous long warfare in such an asymmetric playing field. That's just my kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that is an absolutely that idea about the sort of the oil fighting the desert.
Yeah,
that's an incredible idea.
yeah,
And to pick up on the points you were making about that asymmetrical advantage in the telluric versus the stratospheric. I mean, one thing, obviously very controversial, that Shamayo picks up on in this book is Carl Schmitt, who, despite being, part of the Nazi regime, is still picked up a lot in academic thought. I think mostly because Schmitt's critique is often picked up by sort of people on the left. His basic idea is that his basic critique of democracies is that because democracies only have sort of negative freedom, he would argue, they only have like the freedom from things. They don't have a freedom or sorry, the freedom to do things. They don't have things that bind them together. That they have to look at an outside force to try and make them combine, and that force is an outside enemy. What Gregoire Chamaillou does in drone theories, he draws on Schmidt to talk about this idea of St. George's lance, whereby, I mean, what Schmidt is trying to do, he's trying to drum up sympathy for Nazi Germany. But what Chamaillou does is take this and flips it on its head and says, as Schmidt's saying, well, if the Allies are bombing Germany to smithereens and there's nothing left, this is going to be, it's just a massacre, it's not a war. Chamaillou says the same thing about what's going on in Afghanistan, basically. He's saying that if the Allied powers have this massive advantage through the drone, as you were talking about, that it completely reduces the combatants in Afghanistan to like an other that is just, you just destroy them. And Chamaillou saying, this is wrong. Okay, so the Taliban, the Al Qaeda, they might be an enemy, but if you completely other the enemy to such an extent that you will just kill, you're willing to kill like thousands of civilians to kill some combatants, then that is just going to, not only is that, obviously wrong because you're killing thousands of civilians, but it's actually going to make things worse because it's going to lead to this rage building up against you. And there's a big, there are many strategists, many thinkers within, the United States military who say that whole drone warfare is just the complete anathema to how you stop conflicts. It should be boots on the ground. You should be, for however flawed this might be, is it should be, you're in the country, you're trying to rebuild the country, you're trying to win hearts and minds, whether that actually works or not. But that drone warfare is the complete opposite of that, and it will just make everything worse.
Yeah, as far as I understood, the peak or the beginning of the drone war in Afghanistan was around 2013. Is that correct? And it was at its peak then around 2015, 16, something like that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's a reasonable correlation, if we can conclude that, but I think that was also the time of the highest gain in members in the Taliban, among the Taliban. And it would make sense to the extent that, imagine someone's village gets bombed and they're one of the few surviving men, and whatever bombed it is just some no-name thing, and then someone from the group comes to you and says, gives you a weapon and says, do you want to take revenge? Nobody would turn that down. You've lost everything. Everyone would say yes to that. Everyone would want revenge, especially in a culture where revenge is part of the code, the moral code, right? So I would say that in a very dark and morbid sense is a very effective recruiting strategy for the Taliban, to just go to these villages that were bombed and ask if they want to take it out on who'd done that to them, right?
And again, exactly, Chamaillou talks about asymmetrical power deserves asymmetrical rights. So what he means by that is not some kind of pistols at dawn, pistols drawn at dawn, absolute equality. You give the Taliban and the United States forces exactly the same power, but there should be at least an equal right to fight. And again, that links in with exactly as you were saying, with the uptick in recruitment was when drone strikes were taking place. I mean, there are lots of different examples of this, terrible examples. And again, this goes back to the frailty of technology, and heaven forbid, if this was in AI hands, but there are terrible examples for which we have the entire transcripts whereby, drone pilots tracking a large group in a series of vans, and believing that these individuals are off to some kind of some Taliban training camp, and lo and behold, these individuals get out of the vans every so often and they're praying. So this must mean that they're, like religious extremists. So they call in the strike and blow up these vans, and then they can see like there's children running out of the wreckage, etc. And all it was just a convoy of families going to some family gathering somewhere.
Yeah,
Uh,
likely a wedding. It's very common to have big wedding parties, right? Yeah, yeah, that is something. And I think what one thing to definitely address now, and what is fascinating, that is the other side of the story. And obviously the technological advantage has, according to UN numbers, also led to the death toll being way higher on one side. Like the Taliban were not even capable of killing as many people with the technology they had, like even if they tried. And they the interesting thing is, yet they were still not beaten. You had this technology, but you were still not able to beat them. Of course, it's a different thing. That's still a different thing than them winning. Like like they didn't win necessarily by military dominance. The Americans left. The Americans retreated from the country. If they had stayed, it would have been probably very hard for the Taliban to beat them. But yet the Americans also didn't win. It was also not something they could win. And that also goes to show that apparently there is something beyond the technological side which can withstand this. And there's an article, I forgot where it was written, but they use that Arabic term asabiya. Asab are like it's like you like your nerve, your passion in a way. Um, it, your I don't know, mood, passion. I don't know how to translate. Well, if you've broken asab, then your mood is ruined in a way. So asabiya is like, it was this kind of intense force of belief and loyalty to your ground and culture that was just not even breakable with this technology. Like even the most high-tech technology couldn't break that. And then the strategy of guerrilla war combined with that strategy of guerrilla warfare that was just like opaque. They disappear and they dress like everyone else, and everyone could be a terrorist, and it just fosters this paranoia among the patron force, which is the American army. There's this paranoia which just makes them suspect everyone, even in their own ranks, and thus makes the relationship and the loyalty of the old government very frail. Because when the Americans left, there was at least twice as many soldiers of the army than there were Taliban fighters, but they gave up without putting up a fight. Because like once your boss just packs his stuff and leaves, and you were just constantly, there was no real relationship, no real loyalty built up to that. Like, why would you risk your life? And I think that's also very fascinating to see how such a technological power had to yield and retreat in the face of like old school mentality.
And again, I think part of something else which we've studied recently with Johannes, I was doing the Baudrillard sessions. Did you do the Baudrillard sessions as well, Sean? I can't remember.
I joined the second one. I wasn't there for the first one.
And yeah, we were. I mean, something else which I found pretty fascinating about that as well. Just bringing up some notes here that I wrote at the time about that, just to refresh my memory. Is why does it seem that way? And there's something there which Baudrillard writes in his essay about the Twin Towers, the spirit of terrorism and Requiem for the Twin Towers, and he talks about the idea that even though the Americans put boots on the ground and they sent so much materiel and so many troops in, why does it feel like the Taliban still won? And that's because through the Taliban, that connection between the Taliban and Al Qaeda, through attacking the Twin Towers. Basically, the Al Qaeda won on the symbolic level. There is nothing that the Americans could do which would have such a symbolic impact on Al Qaeda, on the Taliban, as the Al Qaeda had on destroying the Twin Towers. That was such a symbolic victory.
I have to say, you have to be careful with equating Taliban and Al Qaeda and putting, because that was also largely a part of American propaganda to justify the war. So we have to be careful on that front. But that you definitely have a point there with the symbolic victory, and also the importance. It shows the importance of the information war and the propaganda. You have to, like, this, the propaganda kind of on the other side in the Afghanistan war, on the Afghan or Taliban side, that kind of propaganda, it wrote itself. The people were already very religious. The people are already very connected to their people, to their tribes. They're already very tribal, very connected to the land. It had written itself. Whereas for the other side, it kind of, no one really knew why we're fighting, like it was this constant confusion. Why are we there still? What is going on there? And then it's like, yeah, bin Laden, but like, isn't he dead already? And then like, yeah, but what about terrorism? And it's like, yeah, but what's the connection where he wasn't bin Laden even in Pakistan? And it just got really confused. It was like, even if there is a reason, it's like you need to read half a book to understand the reason, and that's not how you get a people behind a war and supporting a war. It's like some tribal people at the other end of the world. What's that? How is that our business? I think that's another big thing. They are defending their blood and soil and their people, whereas what were we doing? We're like sitting in Europe and in the United States and watching it on TV sometimes. And what are we doing? And I think that information aspect is a big one. You could say that the Cold War was the big kickoff of like information warfare, because it kind of correlated with the rise of the TV, with television. And television is an insane, like, information technology. It's insane. Like, we've never had such an explosion. And Baudrillard even talks about that in Simulacra and Simulation. He refers to television as the implosion of the nuclear, right? He says that like the nuclear weapons, the non-usage, but the existence of them, a system that maintained those nuclear weapons but didn't use them, that was not without consequences. Those nuclear weapons they did detonate, but they imploded in the information warfare. That kind of, the fallout, the consequence of having these nuclear weapons, just having them, was an explosion in the interior. It was an implosion of mass media. It was this saturation and like aggressive. It's basically, you could call it like a tool of warfare. It's basically aggressive information bombardment of the population en masse, on a mass scale, which just wouldn't have been possible. I think in a lot of ways the wars in pre-industrial ages were probably justified on similar grounds as the Taliban justified their war. They were justified based on our people, our religion, our kind of a form of tribalism. And now we have this abstract sense. We have this like terrorist network that's somewhere somehow connected, and somehow these terrorists, they used to work for our secret service and they don't anymore. And what like, what's going on? It's crazy. It's
and again, that's what Baudrillard says. He says that sort of the endlessly replaying that footage of the collapsing buildings worked in Al Qaeda's favor. It was kind of a automatic writing, as Baudrillard puts it, whereby any report or rumor of terrorism around the world sort of accrued to bin Laden, granted him this sort of omnipresent quality, in which, as you were talking about there, about the nuclear and the television, Baudrillard says that what the Twin Towers attacks combined was the 20th century's two elements of mass fascination: the white magic of cinema and the black magic of terrorism. Mm-hmm. So, these endlessly replayed images just blew everything. They basically gave Al Qaeda a propaganda victory.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah, I never thought about it that way. But yeah, it is a messy situation and really really hard to grasp and like especially in, as you said earlier, in game theoretic terms. Right. I have to say I don't have much more to add to this. Do you have anything to add to finish up?
Yeah, just a couple of things, just to circle back round maybe to when you were talking about the Ukraine war and boots on the ground, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're talking about Al Qaeda, what Baudrillard says is that one of the ways that they won, in the symbolic sense, was that they trapped the United States into what Baudrillard calls the terrorism of the poor. And what that means is actual throwing resources into things that never works. So Baudrillard says that the terrorism of the poor is where you attack buildings or something like that to try and gain some political end. And that doesn't work for Baudrillard. Whereas what Al Qaeda had done was to attack. They'd engaged in the terrorism of the rich, so to speak. They'd used Western weapons, box cutters, planes, training to attack the West symbolically, and that's how they won. So materially, the Americans might have thrown a lot into this, but symbolically, Al Qaeda seems to have won in that sense. That they sucked the United States into a war in Afghanistan that they ended up just having to leave. Maybe we could flip that around and apply that to what happened in the Ukraine as well. Maybe inadvertently, not through planning, I wouldn't say, but maybe that is what's happened with the Ukraine, or at least initially. We don't know how this goes. The Russians may gather their power and overwhelm Ukraine again, but certainly in the beginning, it seems like the symbolic victory for the Ukraine when they managed to push the Russians out was akin to that difference between the terrorism of the rich and the terrorism of the poor, so to speak. In that the Russians had the surprise advantage, but they didn't have that symbolic victory, at least at the beginning. They were pushed back by the Ukrainians, who then had a symbolic victory for some time. Of the weak overcoming the powerful, let's say, perhaps. But yeah, anything else you'd like to, just to bring it back round to drones? Or
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point to kind of end, because we kind of exhausted the topic, and the drones are kind of, because we ended up talking about symbology in a way, the symbolic victory, and I think the drones kind of have been the symbol of this conversation. It's kind of the symbol of the informational warfare and the physical warfare kind of coming together, right? And I think that's kind of what's been guiding the warfare nowadays, what's been guiding what we've been talking about, more or less. And it's this, the informational one is purely kind of abstract, hard to grip. The other one is too concrete, it's too concrete to actually understand for people who are not involved in war. And then the drone is kind of where they meet. The drone is the informational warfare where it arrives in the real world, and that's the spooky aspect, you could say. That's the spookiness about it. That's perhaps the reason to ban it. Like, You have, you know, and have you seen The Matrix?
Yes.
You know, there's this time when Agent Smith suddenly appears in the real world, right? He somehow manages
Right.
to come appear in the real world, and that's almost like the scariest part of the whole thing.
Yes.
It's almost the scariest part because the machines are in the real world and they're scary. Yeah, that's fine, and the agents are scary in the Matrix. But like you can escape the agents if you leave the Matrix, but then this agent makes it into the real world. That's the creepiest thing. That's the most horrifying thing. And kind of now with the drone war and the box, the death box, or what was it called?
A kill box.
Killbox. Um, yeah, we've the same things happened there. The information warfare has now kind of come to the real world, the physical world, and in a way. And the I think that goes. I think Baudrillard becomes more and more relevant with these things. There's the it shows that it's not virtual reality that's the future. It's actually augmented reality. It's actually the GPS not in a video game. It's the GPS that has put our actual world into like a simulation, right? And that's also, I think, why he didn't like Matrix that much. He preferred the Truman Show because the Matrix actually still has that clear cut difference between the virtual reality and the actual reality. Whereas in the Truman Show, it's like, when is Truman? Have you seen the Truman Show?
Yes.
Yeah. When is Truman arrived in the real world? Was it when he opens the wrong door and he sees the camera people? Was it when he escapes his little town set? Was it when he escapes the dome? Like, when is he actually in the real world? You know, and that's not clear, and that's not. And it's the same here. We've kind of the kill box is nothing else but the dome Truman is in, and it just in the warfare scene. Um, that would be my kind of concluding or remarks on that front.
Yeah. And just to wrap up on that, yeah, I would totally agree that the drone is kind of the physical instantiation of the cybernetic network,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
feedback and exchange.
yeah. James, thank you very much for this conversation. Very, very insightful. There's a lot of things about warfare I didn't know about, and now I know them for better or for worse. And
I've really enjoyed it, Sean. Thank you very much.
yeah, I'm looking forward for our next conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.